Welcome back to our YouTube series on polymers we encounter at almost every corner. We hope you've enjoyed our past videos on gloves, masks, adhesive, biomaterials, and so many other things.
Today, we're going to expand our look at biomaterials and look at polymers in therapeutics. So in our last video, we looked at vaccines and polymers, and an important use of polymers with vaccines was both the storage and delivery of vaccines.
That's right. And today we'll look at both how polymers are used as key components of the therapeutics themselves and how polymers can be used to store therapeutics. So let's start with the sort of storage and delivery part of the puzzle. Are these polymers that we've seen in our previous video series?
Yes, it turns out that high density polyethylene, so known as Hdpe, and low density polyethylene, known as LDPE, are two polymers that we saw in our prior video on vaccine production. And again, here, these polymers are used with many other therapeutics for both storage and then also during administration of the therapeutic to a patient.
Right. So LDPE is often used for tubing, for intravenous catheters to deliver saline and drug context from an IV bag. In contrast, LDPE, in comparison to LDPE, we looked at Hdpe last time around, and we saw there's less branch. How will that affect its usage?
Right. So, thinking back to our prior video and then looking at the cartoon structures that we have here on this screen, LDPE is a polymer made from the monomer ethylene and has a very high degree of branching. So this results in really a looser packing of polymer chains and really gives that material or that bulk material flexibility that you want in certain circumstances. And then as you can see from the other part of the slide with Hdpe, while both of these polymers are made from ethylene, the key difference is that Hdpe has much less branching. And what this does is it allows these polymer chains to pack together much more tightly. And it really makes a bulk material that is more rigid. And it's really useful for containers that hold their shape. This is really convenient for storage of therapeutics. So in addition to storage and the delivery of these therapeutics, you can also incorporate polymers into therapeutics. So how are these polymers used as actually part of the therapeutics themselves?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So this is where the polymers for therapeutics gets really interesting. So let's start looking at the polymers connected or conjugated to biologic drugs. So first, we'll probably want to define what exactly do we mean by a biologic drug?
Right, and that's a really good place to start. So these biologic drugs are actual therapeutics themselves, but they are biological polymers, right? So they are made from monomers. These are typically proteins, so where the monomers are amino acids, but they can also be DNA or RNA. And typically the synthetic polymer that's used is polyethylene glycol. And this is also a polymer that we have previously seen in our video series.
Right, and why do we want to conjugate a polymer to some of these biologic drugs?
Well, the primary reason is that the human body has really evolved a number of defenses that both identify and degrade or eliminate foreign material, such as biologic drugs. Conjugating a polymer to the biologic drug, so to the protein or to the DNA or RNA, can really help this biologic evade those defenses. And for example, if you take a polymer, connect it to or conjugate it to a biologic, such as a protein, one of the things that this does is that it prevents or greatly slows digestion by proteases and recognition by antibodies. So a really important outcome of this is that this allows that polymer biologic conjugate to remain stable over a very long period of time.
That's really interesting. In some cases, this can actually reduce the number of injections of a drug that is needed, with some polymer biologic drugs conjugates being effective for weeks at a time compared to, say, a single day or sometimes even less for unmodified biologics.
Yeah, the use of polymers connected to or conjugated to these biologic drugs has been really a fantastic benefit for patients. But these polymers conjugated to biologics or connected to them are really, they're not the only use of polymers in therapeutics. So what about the encapsulation of drugs?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting area with polymer drug conjugates and polymeric micelles in clinical trials for delivering anti-cancer medications. What this kind of does is it takes advantage of the altered properties of blood vessels in and around tumors. So there's often some enhanced permeability in these blood vessels around a tumor, which allows polymer encapsulated drugs to leave the bloodstream and actually enter these cancerous tissues or these tumor tissues specifically. This increases the effectiveness of the anti-cancer therapeutic and can help to reduce side effects by specifically delivering the drug to where it's needed, the tumor, and delivering smaller amounts of the drug over a longer period of time.
Yeah, that's a interesting, really fascinating, application of these polymers in these drugs. So, thinking about it, how do these encapsulated drugs work?
This area has two sort of distinct approaches. The first approach sort of encapsulates drug molecules in a way to sort of shield and transport them.
Right. So you can think about these polymeric micelles. They're really essentially like a spherical shell around these drug molecules, right? Where a portion of that polymer, typically this is called the hydrophilic block, or it likes to interact with water. Typically that will be on the outer edge or outer face of that shell. And then another portion of that polymer, which is what we call the hydrophobic block, is a part of the polymer that does not like to interact with water. And that's typically on the inside. And that's what basically forms a cavity that the drug is contained in. And one of the ways that you can do this is you can take a combination of two different types of monomers. You can take a negatively charged small molecule, and you can couple that to polyethylene glycol, for example. That can help form these polymers that make these micelles. And it's interesting because these micelles really allow for a slow release of the drug, or almost leaking of the drug out of the micelle. And so giving the patient a single dose of this polymeric micelle drug really allows for this drug to be supplied in a single dose, but then to administer the drug in a smaller quantity over a longer period of time.
Yeah. But there's sort of a second approach, right, that directly attaches the drug to the polymer. Is that correct?
That's right. So the second approach, what we're going to do is we are going to use a polymer with a backbone of 2-hydroxy methacrylamide. This is known as Hpma, so you can see that on the slide there on the screen. And this Hpma, this is going to form the backbone of the polymer. And then attached to that backbone in specific locations is going to be a short string of amino acids. And it's those amino acids that then directly conjugate to or connect to the drug. And it's a very interesting hybrid approach. And there's important roles played by both the synthetic polymer and the amino acids. And here, the amino acids, what happens is that they are recognized by a protease. So it's a specific protein found in these cancer cells. And that protease cleaves that amino acid linker. So that frees that anti-cancer drug that's conjugated to it. And what's really cool is that this essentially releases that drug exactly at the site where it's needed within those cancer cells. So, these are very interesting, really cool examples. But are there other examples of polymers in therapeutics?
Yeah, there's beginning to be more and more applications, through other interesting synthetic polymers, where say the sugar molecules are used as a monomer.
Right, so that would be similar to complex carbohydrates that we might find in nature, right?
Yeah, however, these have additional modifications that make them substantially more stable. So dextrin sulfate polymers are being used as antiviral compounds. These sort of work by reducing the formation of new blood vessels that are spurred by some viruses.
And it's interesting. You know, it's really amazing to see how versatile polymers are, and not only that they can be used in therapeutics, but the number of different ways that they can be used. It's really cool.
Indeed. Well, that concludes our episode for today. We hope that you've enjoyed our look into the way polymers serve as therapeutics and ways they can be useful in pharmaceutical type applications.
All right. Thank you for joining us.
Fantastic. Thank you.